So just to make sure, this is about validation still, called Travel Validation Land. It's going to be a presentation by Leonhard Rosenthol and myself. Who doesn't quite know who Leonhard Rosenthol is? So still he still works for Adobe Systems.
I still do, yes.
Yeah, and he's still enjoying it, and I'm still working.
You can't hire me yet, I'm sorry.
Yeah, you can't.
I'll let you know, no problem.
So I still work for callas software and Excise software and serve as the chairman of the association for another day or two, because we will have new elections on Wednesday, and I will probably not be the chairman anymore after that. At least that's my plan.
Yeah. Retirement suits you.
Yeah. I came up with the idea for this presentation a while back when Performer was already going strong and lots of things happening, and there were a lot of things that I was very proud of and very happy with, and there were other things that I was not as happy with. Some of this will have to do with stuff we are going to discuss in the next presentation. But for now, the idea is to look at validation at large. Validation, what is it? What exactly is it? We use the word very lightly, and it may not always be what we think it is when we start talking about it or thinking about it. So first of all, let's see who needs validation. And this is going to be, yeah, that's when you try it on the same machine again. Anyway.
I'm here to get validated.
Looks like
You are awesome.
Excuse me?
You have an amazing face. You've got powerful features, man. Anyone ever tell you that?
No.
Then listen. You look a little down. And it may seem like sometimes people don't understand you. But someday, man, someday, people are gonna see you for what you really are.
You really think so?
Absolutely. You are great.
Need a validation, please?
You are great, ma'am. You have amazing cheekbones.
Really?
Sir, yes. We have a situation. Where?
Oh my God. 6 months over.
What the hell's going on?
You've been through it. You know. You've had so much life experience that other people don't appreciate, but you know.
Plus you do.
They're not patronizing the shops. They're just coming to see him.
Oh, sir. You're in great shape. You work out?
Not for long. I do, actually. A bit. Yeah, thanks.
Young man, we are running a business here, not a social club.
That is a fantastic suit. It really flatters you. You guys work so hard. You are the backbone that keeps this place running.
It always felt like no one really appreciated it.
Yeah, I mean, our jobs are so stressful, and it seems like most of the times people just don't see it.
No, what you do is so important.
You know, I bet the boss would love to meet you.
You are great. You provide hundreds of jobs, sustaining hundreds of families. That's huge.
That's so good to hear. Most times I feel like people don't recognize that. I'm just the big bad man on the hill.
Not at all. You give.
You know, I know some people who'd probably like to meet you.
Mr. President, no matter what people say about you, you have still got a great golf swing. God bless you. You do.
So that's your new job after retirement, Olaf?
So I thought we could have a little bit of fun around the topic of validation. It's not quite the exact same validation we were having in mind. In the last 45 minutes, but I still believe it's relevant to a certain degree. So if we wanted to find out what validation actually is, like to validate, what does it mean? If you look it up in some dictionary, it would tell you it's to confirm or corroborate something. Or, slightly different twist, to give legal force or official confirmation, or to declare legally valid. So it's not just a technical thing that is implied here, but it's going far beyond that, actually. Next, you could ask, so where do people validate except with parking tickets? And I would like to have a short tour of a couple of areas where validation might matter. And there's a lot of things that you could think about, and we don't have to read the whole list, but it does happen, at least if you use the term validate or validation, in a number of areas. Some of these we are more interested in than others. You can validate data entry in a form, for example. That's not what we care about here. But you could do you could validate software, you can validate files, data structures, and so on. And if you want to become more specific, it might be interesting to look at validating file formats or data streams or data structures, like, for example, XML, HTML, like EPUB, like TIFF, or like font formats. Intentionally not mentioning PDF here.
You just had a great session on that prior to this, and you'll hear a number of other ones. So we thought we'd try something completely different.
So, XML.
Oh, my turn. Okay,
Yeah.
good. All right. So I thought I'd talk about some of the markup languages and how those are validated, and sort of give us a bit of a context as we look at the differences between how we might validate textual or markup-based content versus some binary formats as we move to things like TIFF and the font formats, as Olaf pointed out, and of course some of you with your experience in PDF. So one of the things that I always found very interesting about XML is that they broke it into two very different categories when it came to validation. And that is that there is valid XML and there is well-formed XML. And those are two different concepts. And if you think about it, those concepts actually fit very well into other areas. We just don't talk about them in the same way. And that is that a well-formed document in XML has a series of properties. And you can read them up there, if you want to look at the specifics. But the idea is that you followed the rules for making the file. Your brackets are in the right places, your capitalizations are right, you didn't use anything that you weren't allowed to use. It's well formed. So you did all of the right things that you had to do. And in order for the processor to actually read it and know what to do, or not necessarily know what to do with it, but to just read it, and to read it without any errors. And in fact, this is the one case where a processor of XML is allowed to error out, is if the file is not well formed. In fact, it specifically says in the specification, it must not process it, it actually has to error out. Okay? So this is just about making the file well formed. We know all of the syntax rules have been followed. But that's not the same as valid. Valid is where you actually apply a schema, a set of what generically used to be known as a document type definition. We've now evolved that to schemas and other types of things in terms of how you define the grammar for the XML. Because XML itself, again, is just a way to describe something hierarchically using a text format, but what you're describing is what's in the grammar, the document type definition. And that's what makes it valid or not, is whether or not your content actually meets, follows the rules of that grammar or schema or DTD. And so very, very different purposes, validity and well-formedness. The fact of the matter, though, is that while validity, validation is important, we talk about it, and we'll talk a lot about it, the XML community actually really doesn't care at the end of the day. Nobody, almost nobody, does actual validation, or I should say, does it as part of a workflow. You might do it early on, you might do it, occasionally, but you don't run every single file through a validator. You run it through a processor, you ensure that it is well formed, but you don't necessarily validate it. Why? It's slow. It requires extra information. You have to go and find the data and the schema are separate entities. And so how do you get that schema? It can't be contained. You can't actually contain the schema inside the original file. So how do you keep those two files together? And usually it's by URI or URL reference. So you've got an issue there. And at the end of the day, there's not much to gain. Because what you really want to do is you're looking for certain things. You don't care if it's valid or not. You just want to read the data, get the information out, and hopefully in a way that you can actually use it. Validity, in the case of an XML system, isn't useful. And what's interesting is that the HTML world, as you might imagine, actually took those same ideas and rules to heart, which is there is no concept of validity within HTML. And in fact, you can even argue that, and I would, there's no such thing as well-formedness either, because the actual HTML5 specification, we'll use the current spec. Older specs were actually more strict about this. But the HTML5 spec is actually very clear that the well-formedness of the file is irrelevant, and that the user agent, that's their term for what we would call a conforming reader in PDF terms, you just have to deal with it. You find something that doesn't make any sense, here's what you're supposed to do if it doesn't make sense for this reason, and here's what you do if it doesn't make sense for that reason. But you still have to keep processing it, and you still have to do something smart and intelligent. But at least, to the HTML committee's benefit, they at least made standard rules for what to do when there's a problem. So at least everybody consistently handles errors in the same way, and that's a good thing. You can do a check. There is a validity checker. But again, it's not something you do as part of your process. It's something you do, oh, hey, yeah, my stuff is valid. That's pretty good. I'm happy about that. The other thing to keep in mind when we talk about HTML, like PDF, is it refers to a lot of other standards. And many of these match things we care about, font formats, images, and then, of course, other grammars like SVG and MathML and CSS. And again, just like PDF, JavaScript. We've got an entire programming language in there. And each one of these things, in theory, would also need to go through validation, just as you heard Boris talk about in the last session. But they don't do it, because that's not part of their consideration. They don't care about validation. And again, they barely even care about well-formedness. It's about making sure that the processors know what to do in cases of error. So they're more concerned about what does a processor do, and less concerned about how well-formed or valid the files are. So let's turn from those markup languages. I'm going to turn things back over to Olaf to talk a little bit about some of the binary formats.
Yes. Let's have a look at TIFF. And by the way, there's a part of the overall Preformer project that is working on a TIFF validation tool. TIFF is even older than PDF. It goes back to 1986. It's usually perceived as being relatively simple, relatively robust, standardized even. Viewers are easy to implement, and it's widely supported. If I talk to archivists that are not fond of PDF, that's what I hear from them. Now let's look at reality. Looking at, in this case, information from the TIFF4 archiving project from Preformer, their conclusion is, after some initial analysis, that the TIFF specification is actually complex. Some of the features are proprietary. The TIFF standard is referring to numerous other standards, and the baseline, like the easy part, is not often found in reality. So what I was just mentioning before just doesn't apply, at least not to files of interest. And we are looking at a couple of problems that look very similar to what we have in the HTML world, in the PDF world. It's not as easy as it seems at times. This information is extracted from a document from COST, an agency in Switzerland dealing in archiving on behalf of government agencies. So they tended to be fond of TIFF and cautious of PDF. They did a study internally, and they found that there are 74 official tags in the TIFF specification as of TIFF version 6. And there are more than 250 known private tags. And these tags tend to be used widely. So if you would disallow all these private tags, there would maybe not be that many useful TIFF files anymore. Also, TIFF is a vendor specification. Actually, it goes back to Aldus, and then when Aldus was acquired by Adobe, it's now owned by Adobe. TIFF as such never became a standard. It's a vendor specification. There are some TIFF-based standards, like TIFF IT or TIFF EP. Nonetheless, none of these is widely used. They are not very relevant, right?
Correct.
I haven't run into them recently, so I was not quite sure.
Yeah, TIFF EP, if I might.
Yeah.
TIFF EP is, if you haven't heard of it, is actually gaining a little ground. TIFF EP is, you may have heard previously of something called DNG, which is an attempt to standardize the RAW formats used in various digital cameras. TIFF EP is the next version of that. DNG was a proprietary vendor spec. TIFF EP is the ISO standardization of DNG. So right now, it's not there yet. They're still trying to wrap up the standard. But the goal in that community is to make it the replacement for DNG and give it an ISO primature. And I think the biggest downfall in my case is that they named it TIFF as opposed to something else. But at least it's they made some good decisions in that regard. Sorry.
Yeah, and the biggest challenging question for, in this case, cost was which flavor to validate. So maybe it would be okay to accept certain flavors of TIFF, but it was a challenge to decide which subset of tags or whatever it is. This goes back to things that are already that look so simple but are not. Like multi-page TIFF files are relevant. If you want to have a multi-page document scanned into TIFF, you would want a multi-page TIFF file. Nonetheless, how many viewers are there that can handle multi-page TIFF files? Just look at mobile. So you're out of luck if once you go mobile, to the best of my knowledge. Or what they also complain about is that once you go beyond 1 gigabyte, most viewers will fail. And TIFF is interesting for some larger arrangements of pixels. It's actually actively used for that. There's even the big TIFF derivative of TIFF going beyond the 4 gigabyte limit that you have in TIFF, and they want to go 10, 100 gigabytes, and they do it for certain usage scenarios. And what about some viewers fail on 16-bit? So you can do 8-bit, but not 16-bit. But if you want to have high-quality scanned images, you want 16-bit, and so on. There are many viewers. Each of the viewers can do some of the TIFFs, but not all of them. There's no single viewer, to the best of my knowledge, that can handle just about any TIFF file in a decent fashion.
I think our Photoshop team would disagree, but short of Photoshop,
What
I would
about
agree.
multi-page? What about multi-page?
Oh, that's right. We don't do multi-page. You would.
It's that, yeah, it was not focusing
No,
on facts.
I know you're no, but no,
It might be the only bit. It
Yeah.
might be the only
I think
bit.
it's the only thing we don't do.
So, and based on that, the TIFF group within Preforma, of course, had also a challenge in front of them. If you want to write a TIFF validator, what do? Do you want to be just focusing on baseline and be irrelevant? Do you want to do something useful? You can't do everything. Define a subset. So their idea is they want to come up with a validator that works against a specific specification that they would also have to invent based on the TIFF specification and maybe lots of custom or proprietary tags, and then just verify whether a given file matches the acceptance criteria based on that specification, which is a custom subset of what TIFF is like today. So it's not that easy and not that simple, not that straightforward as many people may claim, especially from the archivist community. So that's about TIFF. Let's have a quick look at EPUB. EPUB is relatively similar in concept to PDF because it aims to represent an independent piece of content that you could consider to be a book or magazine or maybe even other types of documents. So it has quite a bit of similarities with the mission that PDF has. If you look at EPUB Check, which is the checker or the validation tool that the IDPF organization is promoting as part of their activities, they tend to call it conformance checking. They say sometimes validation, sometimes they say conformance checking. And the EPUB Check 4 version does conformance checking against a couple of specifications. And again, EPUB is a set of specifications, and in this case they claim conformance checking for some of them, like EPUB 3.0, 3.0.1, and so forth. And then just recently they came out with the maintenance release. Now that's interesting. it points to an implication of doing such tools or technologies. So there might be bugs in the checker. If there wasn't a problem in the checker, they wouldn't have to come up with a maintenance release. Of course, some of the maintenance release might also be about performance and things like that. But there's actually issues, and they find the issues and they need to fix it. So how reliable is a checker that tells you today this is a good EPUB file, and tomorrow you download the update of EPUB check, and it tells you, no, it's not that good. Just something to keep in mind. Yeah.
Oh, I was just going to say, the other thing that's interesting about EPUB before you continue on is, if you're not familiar, so EPUB, as Olaf said, is sort of wraps up a bunch of technically XHTML files. So that's XML that uses the HTML tag set. And so, as we talked about earlier, you get the advantages of being able to check for well-formedness and validity, and that's exactly what the EPUB checker does, is it runs those schemas that we talked about against the existing schemas. One of the problems that that community has been pushing to move from XHTML, which is no longer really supported by browsers and other things, to pure HTML. They want to get with the program, they want to get with modern web. That's good for them, but one of the things they're running into is the future of the checker. Because now, as we just talked about, going from XML to HTML, you lose all of those concepts that make validation and checking possible.
Mm-hmm. If you look at the actual approach they take to checking the conformance of the EPUB application with the specification or standard, they have a couple of types of results that they will report if you run the checker. They could come up with a fatal error message that's very similar to well-formedness in XML. So if you can't even properly read the file, then just give up. So checking is actually not possible. You don't even get far enough to do actual checking of the EPUB file. And then they think of errors as something that will prevent successful EPUB rendering, which for me was interesting to see, because when we do PDFA validation, for example, we look at the file. So is the file conforming to a constraint? So the number must not be bigger than 1,000. We don't care about rendering yet. We assume that if the file is good, then you will be able to render. So they have a more, I don't know how to call this, like purpose-oriented approach, saying, well, my goal is to render, and everything that blocks me from, or blocks the renderer from actually doing the rendering is bad. So it's a slightly looser definition of what's good and what's not good. And then they also have warnings, where they say, okay, it's not compliant, so they go beyond a certain limit, but it's likely to be renderable anyway. So it's like, don't do this, but if you do it, okay. Also interesting, it's much softer than some of the stuff that we do. They report on usage, that's fine, that's similar to what Boris was mentioning, like you can have plugins in Vera PDF and then just report on stuff. They also state that they also have an additional pragmatic focus where they're looking for notable or potentially problematic constructs. And that's something that's also known in the programming world when you use tools like lint, where you try to find things that are they're not violating any rules, but they are just not a smart thing to do. And they may lead to problems later in execution or whatever. So like dereferencing a null pointer, you can do that. It's not forbidden. It would definitely be a bad idea. EPUB checker is ongoing work. They are not complete. They don't claim they have completed their mission. They probably would agree that they will never complete. They do main parts of the validation or the checking based on schemas, as Leonhard was just pointing to. And similar to what we have in HTML, in the HTML world, or even in PDF, they don't do checking of reference resources like images or fonts. So it's just the EPUB XHTML files that they actually look at, and some of the other parts. Just as a last stop in our journey through a couple of validation lands, so to speak, let's have a quick look at font formats. So at Callas, we did our first font parser engine, I think, in 2003 or 4. I don't remember exactly. So it was a greenfield implementation of parsing fonts, which we needed for PDFA conformance testing. And one of the first things I stumbled across is it's very difficult to derive clear constraints from the two-type specification. But there are some sentences that contain the word must. One of these is that all tables in the TrueType font must M-U-S-T, yeah, must be 4-byte aligned. We implemented our parser, and guess what? I would say over 50% of the fonts that we ran into didn't care. And the font renderers didn't care either. The whole idea, of course, to have this requirement was to make processing fonts easier because you can be slightly faster if you can expect tables to begin on 4-byte boundaries. But it just wasn't honored. So one of the strictest constraints in TrueType was hardly ever honored by just about anybody. I think that the more professional font vendors will have honored it. I would assume that Adobe just did it on 4-byte alignment. But this...
Or we just skipped over TrueType.
We focused on Type 1 for a long time anyway.
Exactly.
But you do TrueType fonts.
We do.
Like TrueType shapes, yeah. And it's interesting to see that in OpenType, now at version 1.7, OpenType, as you probably will know, and you can learn more about that tomorrow in the presentation, OpenType is a blend of TrueType and the best of TrueType and the best of Type 1 in just one combined font format. It's a little bit of a hybrid, but it's the norm today, so everybody does it. They inherited a lot of the data structures from TrueType, and now they say highly recommended that all tables be long aligned. So what does that tell us? There's one of the few very strict constraints in TrueType, and nobody cares about it for 20 years now, or whatever. And the world didn't stop turning around. And so one other bit, and it's a very tiny specialist bit, but it just came up recently. So in TrueType, you can have a DSIG table where you put a digital signature. And it just became clear. So we also, when we implemented our parser, we struggled. We never could validate. And then we gave up. And it turns out...
you shouldn't feel bad.
I shouldn't feel bad, no. Many other people have gone through that.
That's why you shouldn't feel bad.
So it turns out, and has just been discussed on the OpenType mailing list recently, that the one main, so the tag goes back to Microsoft. So the one main implementation of this DSIG tag by Microsoft and the OpenType specification just don't align. It's just different. And it's just a tiny bit. It's about zeroing out a certain portion of the file or not. It's a tiny piece. Yeah, and Microsoft just didn't do what they wrote down in the specification because they wrote it down. I think at least. I suspect. So then you wonder why it's another of these strict requirements. Like you must do it like this. And then the main implementation just doesn't do it like that. Nobody else does it anyway because it doesn't matter who actually needs a digital signature. It turns out that it looked like a good idea, but it wasn't that good idea in the end. And it also turned into being used in a very interesting fashion. So those of you who work on Windows, if you see an icon telling you this is an OpenType font with TrueType shapes as opposed to an OpenType font with Type 1 or CFF shapes, we'll have a different icon. So how do you tell Microsoft Windows that you want this icon for your OpenType font? Because the data structures are so similar that you couldn't easily tell from the data structures. You have to put a DSIG table there. Does it have to work? No.
But it should look pretty.
It should look pretty. I found that very interesting. It's funny. Now everybody understands what the right way to do it, and the discussion is whether to adjust this back to Microsoft's implementation or tell Microsoft to adjust their implementation. And it's not clear yet how it's going to end up. One final thing on fonts, and another interesting piece. So there actually, you should look at this, Boris. There is the Microsoft font validator has been born again. There's a guy called Hintak Leung. And Microsoft has handed over the source code, minus some Microsoft-specific pieces, to this guy to be the owner of this code and to maintain it in the open source community. And he has already worked hard during the last year or 1.5 to add missing pieces like CFF support that was missing in Microsoft's own implementation. And it's pretty cool to see how he's doing that. And then it's also interesting to look at the findings. So what are the stumbling blocks they run into? And so one of the slowest parts is the glyph table test to test all the shapes of the font. in the rasterization test, and one of the guys observed that if you do a rasterization test with the large CJK font, it could take about 18 hours for one font. And this is because, I'll get to you in just a second, this is because you would have to test the glyph at different sizes, because it will behave different. There's a pretty cool mechanism inside TrueType shapes where you can adjust the actual form of the shape depending on all kinds of other bits of information you have when you do the processing. In order to be sure that the 6-point sized font would work as well as a 12 and 20 and 120 whatever sized font, you actually have to do it. And then if you fail, you know that something is broken inside your data structures. But only then. It's almost impossible to find out otherwise.
Christoph, you had something to
Yes.
ask?
Sorry, I can't stop my spell checker running.
That's okay.
It's glyph with an F.
That's the name of the table.
Ah, okay, okay.
That's a,
Probably should have put little quotes around
they
that.
have, yeah, it's semi-bold on my screen, but this
Yeah,
projector doesn't give you that aspect. So it's the name of, it's a 4-character name of the table. So it's intentional in this case. It's not the new spelling in whatever English-speaking country. And then they also run in the problems like the original rasterization test is capable of detecting about 60 types of problems, but it has too many false alarms. So a lot of the Macintosh fonts, for example, they cause problems. So that's a limitation in the checker. It's not that the fonts are broken or bad, but currently even this rasterization test, which is very valuable, has its own limits. So validation is really difficult business.
Yeah, and I'll jump in. We have it's not available publicly, but as you might imagine, we have a set of font processing tools as well, one of which does, as much validation as is reasonable, and part of where we cross over that reasonableness boundary is exactly this, which is, in order, as Olaf pointed out, in order to do true validation, if you will, or quote, full validation of a font, you have to do this. You have to actually run through the glyphs and attempt to render them, or at least process all of the instructions. And not only do you run into the hinting problem, these extra instructions that Olaf talked about, which are certainly significant, you also run into the fact that basically what you're doing is executing code. This is live programming code. And the only way to do that is to actually run the code. You can't, what's called statically analyze the glyph descriptions to know that it's correct. You actually have to run it and then hope that you actually get what you expect out. And also hope that you don't have, and we've run into this, which is interesting, our fonts that are designed to be bad. You can actually have an infinite loop in a glyph description, for example. That's never a good thing to run into when you're validating. 18 hours is better than never completing. So, yeah, it is a difficult problem, and many people, ourselves, Microsoft, and there's also, and I meant to mention this to Boris, there's a wonderful open source font processing system called TTX, which I recommend, also has a number of great tools. It doesn't do validation, but it does something pretty close to it, which is very good. So,
Yep.
yeah, anyway, back to you.
So that was just a quick journey through a couple of corners of this industry where we also deal with file formats, and we might be interested in doing validation. I hope it became clear somehow that it sometimes it's not as straightforward as you would hope. It still looks useful to think about validation. We should not give up on it. It's important. But in order to have some more thinking and reasoning around this, and maybe some discussion, I recommend to go to the next session. So we are on time.
Good.
We're
That's fine. We had to catch up after Duff ran away.
Yeah. So which is going to be, and I have to actually pull this out, in a different room. I think
We're
it's in
over
the large
we're
room.
in the big, we're in the big hall.
Yeah.
So this will be the Olaf and Leonhard show again. So if you liked us here, we'll be performing over there shortly.
Yeah.
So it's the same entrance fee.
Yeah. So it will be half past the full hour.
Oh, we have a break first.
A break first. So
Excellent.
grab some coffee so you can stay awake.
Or a beer if you don't want to.
So this was a kind of introduction to the presentation we're going to have in the next session. And we're intending to come up with some controversial ideas that will hopefully trigger some discussions from at least some people. Dov, Boris, for example.
So any questions on what you've seen so?
Yeah.
So any questions, thoughts, comments? So we said we think this one was, as Olaf said, is the precursor. We think the next one is really the one where we want to get you thinking in perhaps different ways about validation than you might not have. But hopefully this gave you some thoughts about how other communities deal with validation. So, yeah. So thank you.
I have a question. Given the complexity of a lot of these specifications and the difficulty in validating them, do you think potentially they could be cast aside by people because they are unvalidated?
They could be.
Whether they can people will ignore them or not use them because you can't validate them. Well, I'll give an answer while you
go ahead.
Okay, no problem. So I think as a technology person, as a if you will, as purist and standards, you would like to think that. I mean, I certainly would like to think that in some ways. But the reality is that people don't care, and I use HTML as sort of the best example of this. This is a standard. I mean, it's a standard. It is an international standard published by a standards body, whose the people building this standard, literally do not care about well-formedness, validation, correctness. And my favorite example of this, and this is something I fought for a while with them on, is versioning. There is no version in an HTML5 file. It just says HTML. And the reason is because versions aren't important. The processor will just do the right thing. I'm like, but how does it know to do the right thing if it doesn't know what version it should be doing the right thing for? And they're like, because it's always the latest version. And it's a mindset. And so I agree with you, it's a bad mindset. I think it's crazy. But unfortunately, what I've found is that in certain parts of the world, and that's a big part, that's the reality. You take the hammer, you take the 2x4. Sometimes it works. Sometimes, a lot of time, it does not.
Well, that's fine in the HTML world where garbage is acceptable, where nobody has any genuine expectations for what comes out of a browser. Nobody has a right to expect anything particular, precise. But in our world, we have no value if we don't deliver something specific and particular and precise, and in fact shareable, and in fact reproducible. So I accept the points that you've made, but they strike at the very heart of the value proposition of this format.
I will, yes and no. And I think the difference is, and you sort of hit on it, but I'll tweak it a bit. I think the difference is in the longevity of the content. You're right that most people view web content as ephemeral, something that's there temporarily. It may not be there tomorrow, it may not be there in another couple of minutes. Whereas a document, a PDF, especially in PDF, people think of as having a long life because you're going to stick it on a floppy disk, or you're going to stick it in the cloud. You're going to stick it somewhere. Okay.
What?
I know you're not that old. It's okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. But you'll stick it, and you'll expect it to still be good when you come back to it. Now, and so I think that is true. That is a big part of it. It doesn't necessarily mean, and I think this is we'll get to in the next session, where validation falls into that. I think when we talk about PDF-A, I think that's a very different story than perhaps PDF. Okay, but again, this is a controversial issue, and we'll absolutely take some of this up in the next session. David, and then we'll come back to Frank.
Do that because I think you're making the problem look smaller. Actually, I think it's wrong in HTML, just as wrong as it would be in PDF to not validate properly. And I don't want to know how many hours are lost because there is no validation or no expectations. People are just working around it. They're spending way more time and money to work around something that they shouldn't have to work around if there was a standard that was followed a little bit more properly.
I don't think anyone in this room disagrees with you. I was sort of, and if I came across that I agree with that, I apologize. I'm expressing my experience in participating in that world. But yeah, I personally, I 100% agree with you, and I think Olaf and probably everybody in this room would agree with what you said, David. Frank, and then
I'm happy to see that things are moving along in the validation process for all of us who want to use those documents that the software produces. I'm happy to see that people are looking at the other formats and say, what can we validate, what can we not? The complexities, the time it takes to consume to do it. I fully understand not trying to validate everything every single time because it costs too much. But when we have a problem with a document, we need to pull it out and take a look and say, what's broken here? When did it get broken? How can we prevent it being broken? And can we repair it? So that's excellent where it's going. It's a move in the right direction, and we're never done. Because somebody will come up with something next year that we nobody thought about yesterday. So, but we know where we're at. As you said, some formats you just can't validate. They're not required. They don't care. And this one we do to a certain degree. And I think the validator is moving in the right direction. It's not directly related to any individual company to do it, and that's what we need. So that it will pull everybody together and give them that common goal and say that's what we achieve, and everybody can agree on that. And that's the culmination of the association to have that, so that everybody's working on that one thing, and it will be a work in progress as things develop and move on. Because none of us are perfect, but it will give us the best
Except for
reliability we can have.
Just ask.
Okay, any other questions or
Thank you, that
remarks?
was a great way to
Yeah.
wrap that up.
Yep. Okay.
Just probably a very minor remark. In like 80% of web development projects we've been involved, the requirement to pass websites or validate WC work was there.
So there is some interest.
Yeah, and there is a strong requirement from the customers that their web applications are validated according to whatever profile, 4.01 or whatever.
Well, that's just a stupid customer.
Yeah, I understand.
It's probably the Europeans versus the Americans.
No, it's not everybody, but the majority.
Okay, thanks a lot for staying with us.